Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the final session of the first season of Beth Lita Online's uh, pr- premiere debut Gemara class, The Art of the Sugya, investigating the philosophical and literary merit of the Talmud. We have been looking at the different ways in which the Sugya works as a literary unit. And today we're going to see a fascinating example of time travel, but done through reading. We all know that books were the first time travel machines, right? You read a book, you're transported to another world. It's a beautiful thing. But here we're going to see the ways in which all books are illusions. They are designed to trick you, and you should be always suspicious of every book you pick up. So that's going to be the main practical takeaway: is that you should never trust books or anything else again. So
That include the Talmud?
ah, even the Talmud. We'll see. Maybe that's what the Talmud's trying to teach us. Critical relationships. So we're going to see actually how the Sugya is going to be an incredible magic trick, and it's really going to be a nice like capstone to the series of sessions we've been looking at in terms of, again, the way the Talmud works in terms of it's not just authorship that is creative, but editing. Editing creates a conversation across centuries. And that's one of the literary geniuses of the way the Talmud works as a text. Again, Maseches or Masechta means a weaving, right? It's the relation between text and texture, the way in which different threads from different time periods are woven together into a coherent whole. And that's an incredible creative act. So we'll see that in this week's session. But first, and before we get into the inside, I just want to get into the outside a little bit. So I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to look at the text we're going to focus on. But really, again, it's going to be a launching point for what it is, kind of what is a more philosophical question that I want to ask first. So the question I want to ask is, how would you define what is important in your life? What's important in your life?
Health. Good health.
Good health. All right, what else?
Breathing.
Okay, basic autonomic bodily functions. Good.
Are you asking like what's common about all the things that are important in our lives?
I am asking, in terms of the judgments that you make about your life, what is it that you see as important?
Family.
Family. Beautiful.
Peace of mind
Peace of mind.
and feeling centered.
Great. I'm actually going to put a pin in that one. So, when two things like family and peace of mind come into conflict, which I'm sure never happens, how are you able to suss out which takes precedence in that moment? All right, let's say your family member is really wearing on your last nerve. Do you prioritize your personal well-being, or do you sacrifice it for the sake of your family? I'm not asking that in terms of, there's not one answer, but like, right, we see the ways in which things that we think are important, or things that we deem as important, right, judgments we're making, this thing's important, that thing's important. But the world is not a frictionless, smooth sliding adventure. It often involves conflict, contradiction, tension, right? And we're constantly being asked to make choices. And as we know from like one of the few pearls of wisdom we get from the dismal science of economics, is that when we make a choice, there's always a cost, right? Whenever we choose something, something else isn't chosen. Now, there are more complex choices than others in which you're able to factor in a number of different features or aspects or things like that and satisfy a number of different angles, sure. But bottom line is, when we say something is important, or when we invest something with importance, it means that it overrides other factors, which we are also invested in, or we also care about. And how are we able to make that kind of choice? How can we take on that kind of cost? That's a challenging question. Are there ways in which you're able to suss out in the moment which factor or which value takes precedence? Like when you've had a conflict, like your sister is pestering you and you cannot take it anymore? Or what are other things that can come in conflict? What are other times that we've had experiences in which things that we value tend to be at loggerheads? Anything come to mind? Mom, I'm assuming that family has never been a question when it comes to peace of mind?
I think it's very much dependent on the situation at the time, and I think it's in flux, and it has to do with both your own self-survival and the survival of the person you're having conflict with. So I don't think there's I don't think there's an answer. I think there's at each point you have to go back, think of things like what you're just putting forward now, and you have to make the decision at that time as to which one is more important. And I
Okay,
don't think you
this
could do
as-
it in advance
You
or
see this as something
abstractly.
that is responsive, something that is kind of local. There's no way to abstract or to make some kind of universal rule. And that might be the case, I guess, like in our individual lives, right? That might be a very fair point. But I wonder if we kind of recontextualize this question in terms of, let's say, a business setting, right? Or some kind of institutional setting, right? That the way that the ethics work for your profession or the bylaws of the organization will have to take into account these kinds of ranked choices, right? These kinds of prioritizations that you need to make. So this is in a sense thinking about this question, not as like let's say, just an instance or an experience of like, oh, this person's really wearing on my last nerve, but more of a point of actually saying it is a constant feature of my life or the way that I function, that these things are coming into conflict. And that I need to have some kind of way to hash out what takes precedence when I encounter that kind of conflict. So let's see. And we're going to get to, I think, maybe the most complex, but delightfully so, dilemma that the Gemara has given us yet. So here are two Mishnayos, which give us two major principles. We'll look at the first and the second. Might as well. So, kol hatadir mechavero kodem es chavero. Whatever is more frequent than another takes precedence. So before we launch into the specifics, but I do want us to see the specifics, what is more frequent is given precedence. So can we just ignore Judaism for a moment? What would be a good example from our lives of something that is characterized by frequency or constancy?
Traffic lights? I mean, there's a general agreement. Red stop, green go, it's constant.
Okay, traffic lights versus...
Versus not paying attention to them.
I'm
thinking Israel, I guess.
yeah. Well, I would say maybe traffic lights versus traffic circles or something like that.
Yeah, that's also true.
Right, but think of that ways in which something is given precedence because it is something you encounter more. That's another way of thinking about this.
Okay.
Right. So let's say you have
Okay.
Please.
Well, I'm sort of thinking our bodies. So we have to make choices all day long about, I'm late. Do I take the time to eat something good, or do I just grab something on the fly? Or I'm just trying to, sorry, my dog's.
Okay, so thinking of diet, right? So food that is a meal that we that happens more might be something we think about and take precedence over something that is less frequent. Like I need to make sure to plan lunch because I need to eat lunch every day. So if I only have, let's say, $50 in my bank account, I'm going to prioritize food that will feed me for the regular meals, lunch, dinner, etc. I'm not going to prioritize food that is not a constant feature of my life. Snacks, party, right? Those are sacrifices that we make, right? So again, like kind of think about this in economic terms. We have limited resources. If we had our druthers, we would have snacks all the time. But we know that we need to make hard choices, right? So I need to buy the carrot sticks. I need to buy the loaf of bread. I need to buy the food that is going to feed me consistently, not the food that is going to be a treat. If the rubber hits the road and I only have enough money for one of them. Does that make sense? The things that take precedence are things that we encounter more frequently. That's the standard. So let's see how it plays out in the Mishnaic context. Although interestingly, it's worth noting, the textual context for this is Maseches Zvachim, which means the tractate of sacrifices. So this is one of the tractates, one of the whole orders of the Mishnah is called Kodashim, which is all about sacred property, right? Temple ritual, things like that. This is the tractate that is about just the generic sacrifice called Zavach Shalomim. There's the normal, regular, everyday sacrifice. But it becomes kind of like a way to hash out what it is, what are sacrifices, how do they work? So this is one of the kolalim. This is one of the principles that the Mishnah is giving us. Something that is more frequent takes precedence over something less frequent. Okay, good. So, in the temple's offering, the daily offering versus the Musaf offering. Now, when is the Musaf offering offered? Like, think about Shul, right? When do we say Musaf?
On the Chagim.
Chagim.
And
When
Shabbat.
else? Shabbos. When else?
Rosh Chodesh.
Kodesh. Good. Those are all of the ones that we did. Good. When is the daily offering offered? It's in the name.
Every day.
Day. Very good. Musaf, it means additional. Tamid literally means constant. Right? The Tamid offering is offered every day. The Musaf offering is offered on special occasions. So, if you have the Musaf offering and the everyday offering in front of you, which one should you sacrifice first?
The everyday, because it takes precedence, because it happens more often.
You got the
Just like Yaknahas.
Just like Yaknahas, exactly. Just like the way that we order the ending of Shabbos and the beginning of Passover at the end of the Haggadah. Not going to get into that right now, but precisely. The thing that is more constant, the thing that is more consistent, the thing that we encounter more frequently takes precedence over the special occasion. Now that might seem surprising because it's special. You'd think the special thing should go first because it's special. But there's an interesting principle being offered here. It's not the flashy superstar that gets given priority. It's the everyday lunch pail, workaday Joe, right? It's the everyday offering that is valued the highest, even though it seems like it's just gray and blah, because it's every day. The special thing should go first, you might imagine. But no, the Mishnah says, being consistent, being constant is a value as well. Okay, so the more frequent something is, the more it gains priority. Seems to be the outcome of this rule. So, the everyday offering takes precedence over the Musaf offering. Good. And the Musaf offering of Shabbos takes precedence over the Musaf offering of Rosh Chodesh. Why?
More Shabbatot than Rosh Chodesh.
Good. There's more Shabboses than Rosh Chodesh, by an order of about 5. Good. And the Musaf offering of Rosh Chodesh takes precedence over the Musaf offering of Rosh Hashanah. Why?
Same principle.
12-1. Very good. There's more months than there are years. There's more new months than there are new years. Very good. Again, it's surprising because Rosh Hashanah is one of the high holy days. It's one of the 3 times a year Jew days. You'd think maybe it should be important, but no. It's the everyday. It's the regular frum yid that gets to take precedence. As it said, you shall present these in addition to the morning portion of the regular burnt offering. In other words, Musaf is just that. It is the extra additional thing, whereas it needs to be addition to a basis. The basis takes precedence. All right, this seems like we all get the way that this rule is applied, yeah? It seems? Good. All right, next rule, next Mishnah. V'chol hamekadesh me chavero, kodem es chavero. Whatever is more sacred than another takes precedence. So something that's holier than something else now is given more precedence. How would we translate, before we get into the technical aspects of this, how would you translate that into normal, language that makes sense to your experience? Is this a quality or a quantity?
It's quality.
Quality.
Because it's more, it's Mikudash. It's more sacred, I guess is the way you put it. It makes sense.
Right. So Tadir ve'eno Tadir, not frequent versus frequent, is a quantitative measure. I see this person 50 times a year. I see this person once a year. The person I see 50 times a year, I should make sure not to screw over because I will see them. And I'm not going to see the person I only see once a year. That's like a crass way of putting it, right? But that logic makes sense to us. We have certain protective interests in terms of valuing things that we encounter more. Okay? But this is like saying, how do you treat your best friend versus how do you treat a friendly acquaintance? Right? Whose well-being do you value more? Now, okay, you're a beautiful flower child. Everyone deserves happiness and love. That's very nice. But when the rubber hits the road, right? Dismal science of economics. When the rubber hits the road, whose well-being are you more invested in? Your best friend or some person?
Best friend, it's obvious.
Best friend. Of course, listen again, I'm not saying this is a philosopher, like this is the way you ought to behave. I'm just being descriptive. Right? What it means to have a best friend is you care more about them. That's what it means. Right? It's your best friend. They are special to you. Mekudash means sanctify, but it really, in my opinion, means special. Right? Because you're saying this thing is special. And we know this from the language in the Torah, that way, at least the way that Rashi in the Talmud understands it, is that to be mekadesh something means to be designating it as special. Right? That's when we make kiddushin as part of getting married. It means I am designating you as special amongst all the other people in the world. You are special to me. Right? The relationship of the Jewish people and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. It is a relationship of specialness. We are regarded with special favor, a special relationship. Okay, so like the word like holy, sacred, these are words that like I don't know what they mean. I actually don't know what they mean. But special, I know what it means. Right? I get what I mean when I say someone is special to me. Right? It's a qualitative measurement. Eric, did you want to say something?
Yes, I was going to say that the study of Tanakh takes precedence over the study of Torah.
Torah is part of Tanakh.
What?
Torah is part of Tanakh. It's the
No, I said over the study of Talmud, I meant.
Oh,
Sorry.
Talmud. Well, it's an interesting question, right? Because tell that to any yeshiva. Because they sure don't, there's fun, no, this joke is one of my favorite jokes. A Rosh Yeshiva walks, two people are learning yeshiva, and sees like this book on the table, opens up the book, it's like, oh my god, this book is amazing. It's got all of the quotes from the Gemara in it, and it's the Bible, right? So yes, theoretically the Tanakh is more important, but think about Judaism as a lived experience, right? The Talmud is something given far more precedence in terms of what we value and what we spend time doing. Now, like there's been certain pushbacks on that by the Reform movement, by Zionism and things like that, to kind of try to make the Bible the main Jewish text, but at least in terms of like lived Jewish experience, the Talmud is seen as more taking priority, I think, because it is about, well, like, I guess that's an interesting question, right? Like, why? Because if you have a stack of books on your table, and this actually is halacha, you need to put them in order of what's holier than another. And what book, Eric, goes on top?
Chumash.
Exactly. The Torah goes on top. It goes on top of the Gemara. It goes on top of the Rishonim, etc., etc. And yet, if you look at it from a quantitative measure, right, not as an object, but as an experience, which takes precedence in terms of what occupies the average yeshiva student's day, it is not reading the Tanakh. It is learning Gemara, right? Studying halacha. So here we have a very interesting example of uMekudash, right, an object being special, versus Tadir, an experience being more frequent. A very nice encapsulation of this issue. So, kol uMekudash mechavera kaidem es chavera. Something that's more sacred takes precedence over something that's less special. What's an example? This is where it gets very technical, and we see it. This is about sacrifices. The blood of a chatat offering, a sin offering, precedes the blood of an olah offering because it brings favor. Now we have because. Very interesting. So to translate this quickly, so the chatat offering is a very important sacrifice because it's one that forgives you. You do something wrong, and you have to bring a chatat to be expiated, to be atoned for, right? Chatat offering is the technology that the ancient Jewish world had to make sure that you're good with God. So of course it's the most sacred one in that way. And the most sacred component of a sacrifice is the blood. The blood, right? The blood is because ki adam hu hanefesh, right? The blood is lifeblood. It is the essence of the sacrifice. Because what you are doing when you're making a sacrifice is you are taking the life of something. And what is the essence of a life? Blood, right? So the blood is the physical embodiment of the act that you are doing, namely taking a life, which is never treated lightly in Judaism. This is a defense of sacrifices. You can't have factory farming and a temple, because the temple is where sacrifices were done with thought and intention, not done just as a chain, right? Nowadays, we are far more barbaric when it comes to taking animal life than we were in the ancient world when that was a part of our worship. There's a bit of an ironic twist there. That's just my opinion. But I'm gonna, you know what? We're gonna move on. I'm just gonna let that simmer, let that blow your brain a little bit. Okay, so the blood of the chatas offering is more special than the blood of the olah offering. Now, the olah is translated in old translations as the Holocaust offering because it was entirely consumed. We tend not to prefer that translation anymore, but the point is, the olah is a very special sacrifice as well. Interestingly, because the chatat does something for us, it makes favor with God, right? It gets us good with God again. It is more special. So interestingly, because this is a qualitative judgment, it is more special than something else, the Mishnah provides a reason. So why is the blood of the chatas more important? Because it provides favor between you and God. Okay, good. So we didn't have a reason. It was just obvious why the Tadir the Tamid offering is more important than the Musaf offering, because we know it's more frequent. Fine, that's obvious. But now we're giving a reason, because it's a qualitative judgment. Okay. So, the limbs of an olah offering precede the innards of a chatat offering. Twist, because the limbs of the olah is entirely for the fires of the altar, whereas the innards of a chatat are not. Okay, so here we have the question of what designates something as being special. It seems like what designates something as being special is its closeness to God. So the blood of the olah of the chatat offering is very, very close because it is the aspect that brings us closer to God. Whereas here, the limbs of an olah offering, not to be too gross, are more special than the innards of a chatas, because the limbs of the olah are entirely burned up and they're only for God, whereas the innards of a chatas, I believe, are consumed by the priests, right? Like kishkas or like a Urav Yerushalmi, right? An organ mix. So point being, right? If something is entirely consumed by the fire, and then the reach nichach, the pleasing scent, goes all the way up to heaven, That thing's more important than the thing eaten by humans. So it's worth. We don't need to get into the meaty, grisly details of all of this, but we see clear designations in terms of what takes precedence, and it has to do with what is deemed more special because it's invested with more proximity to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? In some way, it's closer to God. Now, here's where it gets very fun, because has there been a conflict yet? Kind of, right? We have a conflict between the Musaf and the Tamid offering. We have a conflict between the blood of the Chatas versus the blood of the Olah. But it's a resolved conflict because there's a rule and the rule wins. We have a rule. It's an algorithm, right? As Shosh said in the chat. The algorithm rules everything, right? You plug in the algorithm and you take all the specific things, the pratim, the specific things you need to deal with, and poof, out pumps a resolution, right? We have an answer. You take two things that are conflicting, blood of the Olah, blood of the Chatas, you plug them into the rule and you have an answer. The blood of the Chatas is more important, so it takes precedence. Okay, good. So it's not a problem. This doesn't seem like Gemara to me. Talmud needs to be more problematic. We need to make this more complicated. Oh, don't you worry, my dear friends. We will right now. Because if you were to put these two rules in conflict with each other, which should take precedence? That's the meta question. So another way is asking is, which is more important? Constancy or something being special? What's more important? Your neighbor who you see every single day, who you share a property line with, or your best friend? What takes precedence? Okay. I'm serious. Which takes precedence?
It depends on the situation. I agree with Eric.
No, rules.
No?
Rules.
Rule. Okay, so in that case, it would be your neighbor who you see every day, assuming you see your neighbor every day and not your best friend every day. But if you saw your best friend every day and you don't see your neighbor like more than once a week, then I would think your best friend would be precedent because
I wanna it's so good. Wait, and you're gonna get why you just intuited the Gemara almost exactly.
Oh, thank you.
I don't want to give away how, but you're saying, what if we were to equalize them? Right? And show actually that there's not really a conflict in the end. There's not two axes of conflict, constancy and exceptionality, but rather there's only one axis of conflict, and now we just have one of the rules to rely on, and now the answer is clear, right? Because if I saw my best friend every day and I saw my neighbor every day, of course I'd take my best friend would take precedence. Avada Gevist, right? Of course, and my best friend, right? Let's say you live on a house. And then on your right side is your neighbor that you have a decent relationship with, and on the left side is your best friend, and you intentionally moved in next to them so you can hang out every day. So who takes precedence? Obviously your best friend. Obviously, because you only have one axis of conflict now. Who do you care more about? So you had to get rid of one of the axes, Lauren, though, to solve that problem. Oh, so you're cheating. Okay, so who has a different answer? So you see your best friend once a year, and you see your neighbor every day, and somehow, in some way, they are in conflict with each other. What do you do? Game this out. There's no wrong answer. I'm just gonna make you feel like you're wrong. Just kidding. Everyone's right. Just game it out. Tell me one of the answers and say why you think that's true. Your best friend, your neighbor. We gotta get to the Gemara. Come on, give me one.
No,
Was the best friend.
Okay, Kathy says best friend. Why?
Well, I have an emotional investment in the best friend.
You love them.
Historical investment.
Okay. And it's more important than than a risk of revenge, let's say, right? It's more important. You're willing to take the hit, right? You're willing to take the hit, And who knows, your neighbor might trim your hedges down to nubs, right? Your neighbor might loose their dog on your lawn. You don't know what they're going to do. Okay, so you say your best friend, and love is proven by loss. Very nice. Okay, who else? Who has a different answer? Who wants to say neighbor? Oh, you're all such good friends. Wish I was your friend. All right, I'm going to say neighbor's more important because they could do real serious material harm to me. Right? Like, yes, my best friend is, listen, it makes me sound like I'm a bad friend. I'm just trying to give like a limud zchus. I'm trying to provide a justification for somebody who would say it's worth taking the neighbor's position. Why? Because they can hurt me. Right? I see them all the time. They can like destroy my property. They can call the cops on me. I don't know. They can do lots of things to me because I see them every day. I mean, this is a way of like making it very clear, right? Like, I think everyone would probably say your best friend because you love your best friend. You're willing to take that risk. Fine. But let's say, what about just a friend? Not your best friend, a friend and a coworker that you see every day. Like a new friend, someone you're excited about becoming friends with, and your coworker that you see every day.
Your coworker, it's almost like an idea of shalom bayit, because really when you're working, it becomes like a family. Right. So if you're really
you're willing to appreciate your life for convenience's sake.
Yeah, if you're in conflict with a colleague, you got a real problem because you got to go there every day, and who needs the conflict? It would be terrible.
Good. So in a way, it's easier to answer the question when someone is so deeply, differential, right? Your best friend's your best friend, and your neighbor is just some schmo. It's just convenient. It's just it's an accident. But what if we like bring those a little bit closer together? It's a friend, right, and someone else that you see consistently, and we get how it's clear now, right? That consistency and specialness both make claims on us. And it's not clear how to resolve those two rules if the rules come into conflict. Or if two things come into conflict, one of the rules might resolve it. But what if the rules come into conflict? And now we're in Gemara land, right? Mishnah land is easy. Mishnah land is like, I'll give you a principle and show you how it gets played out. Gemara land is like, aha, let me take those two principles and see, let's have some fun with those.
Can't you use one to help you with the other? Can't you count on your relationship with your best friend or even your good friend to understand why you're taking the other side, and having that history with your best friend, for example,
right,
and counting on compassion or understanding would still be your best friend, knowing why you made your decision.
Right. So I want to respond affirmatively to that, Mom, and then critically. One is that I think that's a really good point, that people in our lives are not just game pieces, right? They're like human beings with their own agency. And what it means to have a loving relationship with your best friend is you trust that they're going to forgive you, right? They trust that they're going to understand where you're coming from. They trust they're going to be on your side, right? It's like sometimes the people that you love do take a loss or do take a hit because they know that they're part of you, right? They're part of the same team, and sometimes you got to take a hit. However, I'm going to respond critically and say that I think that might be true for people, and that I was trying to translate it to something that makes sense to us. But we're not going to be talking about other people with their own lives. We're going to be talking about things that make claims on us, right? Choices that we need to make. And you could push back and say maybe forgiveness should not be lost when we talk about law, right? Maybe and that's tshuva, right? That's the world of tshuva. But here, I want to kind of push us again in the more dismal side, the economic world in which you got to make a choice, and it's a world of it's a finite world we have, and not everyone wins, right? And what do you do? Like, what do you do when the rubber hits the road? I think that's really this is the same kind of thinking that philosophers, like moral philosophers, make, right? It's everyone familiar with like the trolley question? Right, trolley's going down the road, and you're at the stick, and it's going to hit one person. Sorry, it's going to hit 5 people. Or if you pull it to divert it, it's going to hit 1 person. Would you pull it to divert it? I mean, you got to make a choice, right? And that's an example of a choice that you have to make because something's going to happen. Now, you could decide not to do anything, but that's a choice too, right? So. Again, these are thought experiments, but the thought experiment tells us something very important, that we have to make choices. And can we divine rules that help us make those choices? Okay, so they raised a problem, just as the problem we have raised already. Constant and sacred, which takes precedence, right? Which takes precedence over these two principles. And here it gets very funny. Does constancy take precedence because it's constant? Or does sacrality take precedence because it's sacred? In other words, should quantity take precedence because it's more frequent? Or should quality take precedence because it's more special? And that's exactly the question. Okay? Tashma. Now, a quick Gemara quiz at the end of the semester. What does Tashma refer to? Whenever you see Tashma in the Talmud, what is that introducing?
So this is a story. Come and listen to this story, because this is the machloka.
Okay, it is responding to a machlekes. It's being used to marshal as support for one of the sides. But I heard Eric say it's a breita, and that's true. So it's not a story. That would be a maisa. But it is, Lauren, you're right, evidence for one side of the machlekes. Eric's right that what's being used is a breita. A breita, if we remember, is a non-Mishnah tradition from the period of the Mishnah. Right? It's like the B-sides. This is for all of the hip listeners, record listeners in the class. It is the B-side of the Mishnah. Okay? We all understand that reference. Good. So, the Mishnah B-side says, the daily offering precedes the Musaf, even though the Musaf is more sacred. Oh. So it just tried to twist the Mishnah back on itself. Twist! It seemed very clear that the daily offering precedes the Musaf offering, because it's more frequent. But why did we think that was so clear? Because it was used in support of the rule. But what if we pinned the other rule against it? Which is more special? Wednesday or Shabbos?
Shabbat, for sure.
Of course, we're not worshippers of Odin, the god that Wednesday honors. We are worshippers of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, whose day is Shabbos. Of course, Wednesday is just the hump day. Shabbos. Oh, Shabbos. It's castle in time, right? So it's not obvious that the daily offering should take precedence over Musaf. In fact, you could easily say the opposite. Musaf should take precedence. It's Shabbos. Except that, when is the only circumstance on which a Shabbos Musaf and a daily offering would conflict with each other? Which day would that ever occur on?
Shabbat.
On Shabbos. Very good. Very good. It's only on Shabbos, right? It can only be on Shabbos. So what's the pushback? All right, let's first get the first pushback is the Breita. And the Breita says, the daily offering takes precedence over the Musaf offering, even though the Musaf is more important, is more special. And we see that played out in Shul. Which do we daven first, Shacharis or Musaf? Shacharis.
Shacharit. Yeah.
Exactly. Even though Shacharis is something we do every day. Now, this is being used in support of which position? Tadir or uMekudash?
Tadir.
Tadir. Because the Talmud is more constant, it goes first. Except, here comes the pushback to the pushback. And when you see this word atu, this is the way that the Talmud is trying to unpack an implication. So when you see atu, it's saying, does this imply that the special nature of Shabbos is only imbued in the Musaf offering and not the daily offering? After all, isn't the Shacharis that we daven a Shabbos Shacharis? Not a daily Shacharis. So you can't say then that what? What's the pushback to the pushback being used to prove? And Lauren, this is what you intuited.
So that okay, I'm trying to think.
All right, wait, I'm going to lead us to it. The Tashma is saying, when you have the conflict of two rules, Tadir and uMekudash, quantity and quality wins. Why? Because it's more frequent. So Tadir wins over uMekudash. And then the implication is saying, does this imply then that only the Shabbos Musaf is special? Isn't the regular Shabbos davening or sacrifice special too? So what just happened to the two-rule conflict? What happened to one of the rules?
One took precedence over the other.
That's in the Tashma. Tadir takes precedence over the Mekudash. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
But in the Atu, right? If we say that both the Musaf and the Shacharit are both special because they're both Shabbos services, are there now two conflicts or just one?
Oh, now you go back to they're both Mekudash in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So the way that they phrase that is fine. We call the Musaf service is special because it's only done on special days. But the daily offering is special on special days too. It's the Shabbos daily offering, not just the Joe Schmo daily offering. So because of that, there's no longer a conflict between two rules in which Mekudash versus Tadir wins. Now it's two things that have equal level of sanctity because they're both Shabbos sacrifices. They're both Shabbos services. And they're equal in sanctity, but one of them is more frequent. So which one wins? The more frequent. In other words, which side is this being used to support? If the Tashma is being used to support Tadir, because Tadir versus Mekudash, Tadir wins, what side is the Atu being used to support? There's one
The
other.
Mekudash, the more sacred. But this kind of plays with it and makes so both are sacred. So then both being sacred, so you go back to the which is more constant.
Right, good. So I'm going to assign point values, right? So to look at the Tashma says the daily offering versus the Musaf, daily offering goes first, even though the Musaf is more holy. So the daily offering has a Mekudash a holiness level of 0, and the Musaf offering has a holiness level of 5. But since the daily offering is more frequent, it still wins. That's the claim, right? The pushback to that says, the Atu says, no. The daily offering has a holiness level of 5, and the Musaf offering has a holiness level of 5. And the only reason the daily offering goes first is because it's more frequent. Because these two aren't in conflict anymore. Mekudash isn't a conflict. It's been resolved. So there's now only one rule. And the rule is that the more frequent thing goes first. Okay? So instead of there being a meta conflict between two principles, now there's just one rule, and the rule works. So the Tashma is being used to try to prove Tadir. Try to prove that frequency trumps specialness. The Atu is being used kind of to support specialness, sanctity, Mekudash, but really it's being used to say, no, Tadir doesn't win. Because you can't, I'm proving that you don't have an example in which there's a meta conflict of the two rules. All you have is just the one rule, and it's working like the Mishnah says it would. And because it is not this example you're giving is not exceptional, you can't derive anything from it. You can't derive anything from it because all it is just the rule. The more frequent thing wins. Sanctity doesn't apply anymore because the two things are equally holy. We're going to see this play out again and again and again. So welcome to the kind of jazz riff style of the Gemara. Okay? You're going to see it in variations. And I think by the time we get to the end of it, you'll be able to, in a sense, predict it. Let's see if you can even predict it this time. Okay. So Tashma, here comes another Breita proof. Shabbos Musaf precedes the Musaf for Rosh Chodesh. Now, pause. Which is more holy, Shabbos or Rosh Chodesh?
I think Shabbat is the most holy of everything.
Which is the day that you're not allowed to work?
Oh, Shabbat, because
which is the day that determines how your grocery shopping goes?
Shabbat, definitely. Right? By Wednesday, you're starting.
Way of thinking about what's special.
Yeah, right? Shabbat, definitely.
When I do my weekly shop, I think of what I'm making for Shabbos. I don't think about what I'm going to be making in 28 days for Rosh Chodesh.
Right.
So Rosh Chodesh, it has a certain level of sanctity, but it's not as holy as Shabbos. It's Shabbos, right? So Shabbos obviously trumps Rosh Chodesh in terms of specialness. And yet, which do you daven first? Shabbos Shacharis or Musaf Shabbos Rosh Chodesh?
Rosh Chodesh.
You do Musaf first when Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbos? I'll give you a hint. You never do Musaf first. Never, ever. It's the additional, right? It's always going to go after the constant thing. Okay, so here's another example of how they're saying, look, we have something that's special and something that's less special. Shabbos is more special than Rosh Chodesh. However, the Shabbos Musaf sacrifice, the real example of this is when you say Shabbos Musaf davening. And inside of Shabbos Musaf davening, right, the centerpiece of the davening is you rattling off the appropriate sacrifices for the day, right? And when you rattle them off, ironically here, the one for Shabbos goes last, but it's because Achron Chaviv, it's because it's deemed more important. The point is, though, is that when you were doing the sacrifices in the temple, the Shabbos sacrifice went before the Rosh Chodesh sacrifice. Even though now, doesn't that make sense? Wouldn't that say, fine, Shabbos comes more frequently and Shabbos is more important than Rosh Chodesh? But think of it in terms of addition.
We change the Musaf somewhat for Rosh Chodesh.
Yes, we do. So here the question really is, if you have enough livestock to do one of the sacrifices, you can either do the Musaf for Shabbos or you can do the Musaf for Rosh Chodesh, right? Right? That's the question we have. You have to make a choice. Which one is more important?
I would say the Musa for Shabbat because both is more holy and it comes more frequently. So it's got both.
Right. Now, interestingly here, I mean, this is maybe like a bad example.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it in the CD.
No. Don't worry about the liturgy. It doesn't map exactly with the liturgy, but this is an interesting example because it seems like implied by the Tashma is saying that the Rosh Chodesh should be regarded as more holy because it's specialer. In other words, because it's less frequent. This is like buying yourself a special treat, right? You get your special treat. There's okay, I go on vacation to Cape Cod. And when I go on vacation to Cape Cod, there's always a saltwater taffy store I go to, but I only get it once a year. And because of that, it's become so special to me. I make an egg sandwich once a week. It's a delicious egg sandwich and I'm obsessed with it. And I'm so obsessed with it that literally, after I make my bread for Shabbos and I cut a loaf off for Friday night. That's very nice. But literally, even on Shabbos, I am anticipating Sunday because I'm so excited for that egg sandwich. And I only have it once a week. It's so special to me, right? Things that we do rarely also become special. So here we have a direct conflict of principle. Is the more frequent thing more important? Or the thing that's less frequent more important because we invest more of ourselves in it? So Rosh Chodesh is both Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. So because that's even more special because it's invested with the specialness of Rosh Chodesh, which is less frequent. But again, we have the same pushback. Right. But do you think that only the Shabbos Musaf has Shabbos invested in it? No, of course. It's Shabbos plus Rosh Chodesh. So we don't really have the conflict on that level either. Okay. Well, here's maybe an easier example. Which is the holiday that people will make sure to go to shul on? Rosh Chodesh or Rosh Hashanah?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah.
Absolutely.
Right? We don't have 12-day-a-year Jews. We have our High Holy Day Jews, and God bless them. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah is more holy than Rosh Chodesh. It's a Yantiv. It's the day on which we start being forgiven for things. We recrown God as king. It's a very big deal, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Chodesh? What do you really do on Rosh Chodesh? It's kind of special. It's not that big of a deal. And yet, Rosh Chodesh Musaf takes precedence over Rosh Hashanah Musaf because it is more what?
Frequent?
It's more frequent, right, by an order of 12. Exactly. Right, Rosh Chodesh takes precedence over Rosh Hashanah because it's more frequent. However, again, can we predict the pushback? And it's going to be the same exact logical pushback that we saw before. Does this imply what and what? Right, the Tashma is saying we have a conflict between holiness and frequency. Rosh Hashanah is holy, Rosh Chodesh is frequent. Which wins? Rosh Chodesh because it's more frequent, right? So we have the conflict of these two rules, and the one rule wins. The more frequent thing succeeds. But what's the pushback that we saw? Are they really conflicting on both axes?
Yeah, because the thing that's less frequent makes it even more special. So Rosh Hashanah is both special and because it's less frequent, it's extra special.
That's true, but Rosh Chodesh wins.
Oh, okay.
Right. Rosh Chodesh wins. Right. So again, I want to make sure we get the metalogical point. Okay. The Tashma is saying we have a conflict of two rules. We have one thing that's special. Which is the special one? Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Chodesh? Which is special?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah. And we have one thing that's frequent. Which one's frequent? Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Chodesh? Rosh Chodesh. Good. It's once a month. And when you have a conflict between these two things, which one wins?
Frequency.
Well, just say which Rosh Chodesh or Rosh Hashanah wins.
Chodesh.
Rosh Chodesh wins, which implies that frequency wins. So when you have a conflict of two rules, frequency versus specialness, frequency wins. And the way that the Atu is going to undercut it is by saying, you think there's a conflict of two rules, but there's not. Because is it the case that only one of them is special? No. Because what's the day on which this is happening?
Like Rosh Hashanah imparts its Kedusha on the Musaf as well.
Exactly. That the Rosh Chodesh offering on Rosh Hashanah is imbued with Rosh Hashanah. So all offerings made on Rosh Hashanah are equally holy. So it's not that there's a conflict of holy versus unholy. Everything's holy. And when you have two things that are equally holy, which takes precedence? The thing that's more frequent. Obviously, we have that rule in the Mishnah, right? For instance, if you have two best friends, and one of them lives in Seattle, and one of them lives next door, whose feelings do you prioritize if they have a fight?
The one that lives next door. You see that person more often.
Two equal holinesses. The one that's more frequent takes precedence. That's a much easier question to answer, right? Or here's another. Best friend, make it very hard. Let's say you have a coworker that you like, that you're on the same team as, and a coworker that you see once a month. Who do you prioritize?
Your teammate, obviously.
Obviously, because you see them more, right? Your relationship with them is more valuable. It's more prioritized. It should be prioritized more. Those are people of two equal stature in your life. So it's not a conflict of two rules. It's two equal statures. They're both equally holy. And the one that's more frequent, you prioritize more. That's obvious. So that's what the Atu is doing. The Atu is saying, you see this as a conflict between special and not special, frequent and not frequent. No, they're both special. So obviously the frequent one wins. And because of that, then, we can't answer which one wins, Godzilla versus Kong, right? Which one wins, special versus, quantity versus quality, because we haven't actually seen them fight yet. That's what the Atu is doing. We don't have a conflict between quantity versus quality. we have only examples, and every time it's saying this. Every time the Tashma tries to give me an example in which quantity versus quality and quantity wins, every time it does that, it's really giving me an example of equal quality. Then obviously quantity wins, and that doesn't tell us anything new. We already got that from the Mishnah. We haven't touched anything out from it yet. Okay? So that's really the way that the logic of the Gemara is working. It's the Tashmas are trying to give you examples of the two rules conflicting, special versus constant. And the Atu, right, from the Gemara, is trying to push back and say, no, I haven't seen a conflict between the two principles yet. I've only seen an obvious example of when two equally holy things, then obviously the more frequent one wins, clearly. And you're not telling me anything new. Okay? Good? Any just clarifying questions, pushbacks?
Yeah, I'd like to ask something.
Great, hit me, Leon.
Sorry, this actually, it might help if I was looking more clearly at the text, but I'm a little bit away from my my screen, so I'm not looking at it. But just kind of like, I'm wondering about the level of abstraction at which these kind of rules are written about or discussed in the Talmud, in the sense that, like, given the examples we're using, the ones that you're frequently going back to in terms of like comparing holy days against one another, and then the other.
Evo, you die. Yeah, sorry.
And then also kind of comparing this seemingly kind of maybe more casual or more like an example that draws this closer to our lives, perhaps, of like, friends versus coworkers, etc. Just wondering if these are like rules, they were authored as kind of like rules of guidance, like almost like rules of thumb for any kind of general purpose, or was there a specific, like, was this kind of like a priestly kind of case, thinking about how to order things, and then these rules started to be applied to kind of maybe more broad sort of questions? Or was the intention from the beginning for this to be like an ordering principles that could abstractly be applied to anything and kind of should imbue kind of ethical thinking at the most general level?
Right. So I was having a conversation with my chavrusa, my study partner, just the other day, and we were talking about how the rabbinic literature is deeply theorizable, but it's not theoretical. Right? It's not doing this kind of reflective thinking on itself. It's rather trying to, from the inside, right, give us ways that it's trying to think things through. So, I mean, here I think maybe exactly what we have this conflict is Tashma is saying, hey, we have a conflict between two rules, and I can give you a meta rule that says which rule wins. And the Atu is coming back and saying, no, you can't actually. Right? The Tashma is trying to say, I have a super rule that when Tadir is versus uMekudash, Tadir wins. So it is trying to say, listen, I have this like rule, and it rules over all. Right? This rule rules. And the Atu is coming back and saying, you actually can't decide between the two rules because maybe actually, like, per what you're saying or what Eric was saying from the beginning, it's, we don't have a way just to say it's all just this abstract thing. Really, we need to pay attention to the specific circumstances. Right? Maybe it doesn't say that we can never have a situation in which we have some kind of rule that wins, that two rules, we have one rule stands over all. Right? Maybe not. And maybe that's
So
the false way of thinking.
It is like an argument of logic then. Like, it's saying that in terms of, like, at a very abstract level, it's saying there isn't in fact a conflict here. Or is it saying it in order to try to solve a specific problem? Like, was this thinking, did this come out of a desire to solve a specific set of problems? Or was it more like sometimes it sounds like a logic game to me, and sometimes it sounds like I just don't understand the history, and the people who came up with this and who wrote this down and who edited this were actually trying to solve very like precise, particular problems. And you know what I mean? I don't know which. I don't know how, and somehow that makes it hard for me to understand the relevance of it.
it's the problem is that it is not logic, which is one kind of science that is being discussed, but rhetoric, which is a different science that's being discussed. And the rabbis of the Talmud were aware of both, but the arguments of the Talmud are arguments from rhetoric, not arguments from logic. And there's a distinction you have to make.
True. That's not true. That we have some basic logical tools that are deployed in the Gemara. One of the most famous ones, right, is called the Chomer, right? Whenever you see the Talmud refer to din,
that's a rule of rhetoric. If you look in Roman understanding,
that's a rule of logic. That's a
no.
logic.
There's a difference between logos and rhetoric.
Yeah, poetic.
If you look at those rules, those are the rules that were known at the time as rules of rhetoric, not rules of logic. Logic is something completely different.
Yeah, Eric, I all due respect, I think a good book to read on this would be Saul Lieberman's Hellenism and Jewish Palestine, or Greek and Jewish Palestine. So the kind of questions of how classical learning related to the Talmud and rabbinic period. We're talking about logic. I think the question is right, or the question in a sense, I think that the question I hear Leon asking is it in a sense arbitrary, or is it something that is directed, right? And I think here we have in a sense something between the two of them. But Leon, I actually want to offer a third option in terms of what this can be. Then hopefully that's a good way to think about relevance. So I think what we have here is exactly the question between the rabbis trying to hash out a specific question, namely in ritual law, when two things come into conflict, do we have a rule that helps us figure out what takes precedence, right? Whether it is in the sanctuary, right, in the temple, in which you only have a certain number of resources, you need to devote them in a certain kind of way, or as we're about to see in our liturgy, right, which takes precedence, right, which bracha goes first. But I think there's also a larger question in terms of thinking about priority as a larger question, right? Like how do we judge or how do we adjudicate what's important to us? Is it based on what is more consistent in our lives? Or is it based in what we deem as more special? And we do see the way in which that becomes a kind of abstractable or applicable categories that are applied just beyond the local context of this specific legal or economic question, right? Of devotion, of assignation of resources, or even thinking about things that are important in our religious life. It is kind of a meta-ethical question in terms of how do we think about what's important. And we do see that in the commentary literature. Whether we see that in the Talmud itself, that's what I'm saying. I think the Talmud is theorizable, right? You can do thinking about the Talmud. But I think another way in which, and this has been a constant actually theme I've been trying to pluck in these classes, I think the way the Talmud is most relevant, I think it's easy to get lost in the abstruseness of its details, or maybe the ancient character of it. But if we were just thinking of it in terms of one-to-one relevance, we would get rid of half of the Talmud, right? Because we don't have a temple anymore. We don't keep purity anymore like we used to. Right? There's a lot of abstract ritual stuff abstruse ritual stuff we don't do anymore. Right? And that's why those things don't make it into the Shulchan Aruch, right? Which is like a practical law code. But what the Talmud gives us, and the reason the Talmud still is the crown jewel of Jewish learning, is because it's not about practical relevance. It's about thinking. Is that what the Talmud gives us are snapshots of how to think rigorously. And that's something you can apply to your life because it teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to relate to your life experiences and how to relate to them in a way that is increasingly, I would say, wise. Because you see your life as something that you can think about coherently and critically, and not just strictly from your kind of a bombardment of stimuli and experiences. But the Talmud is giving us a model about how to relate to your life consciously and critically. So I think, there's a bridge, and I think really the bridge when it comes to Talmud learning and the way people fall in love with it is just to dip your toe in. It's really just to kind of be in the pleasure of it, And that's why it is so important, I think, to like let the Sugya speak for itself, because it's really learning a Sugya that you really chop what it is to be in Gemara. It's an experience. All right, so here's maybe an example, though, that maybe is not as much of a historical gap to leap. Tashma, right? Another take, davar acher. The blessing for wine is consistent, while the blessing for the special day is not. So, pause. What's the situation we're describing here? We're invoking?
Probably Shabbat Kiddush or a Chag Kiddush.
Exactly. And
which comes first, right? Which
Shabbos
bracha?
Kiddush, let's just say Shabbos Kiddush for the sake of simplicity. Shabbos Kiddush is made of two different brachas. Which are the brachas?
The bracha of the day and the bracha of the yain.
Good. So Borei Pri HaGefen, right?
Right, and yeah.
Right, so it's called Birkat HaGefen, right? And Birkat HaZman. It's a bracha about time, right? It's about the special time.
Yeah, Yakna has yain kiddush ner. Yeah.
Okay. So it's that when we say Kiddush, we're referring to specifically the bracha of Mekadesh, because the same root, Mekadesh HaShabbos, right? It's about sanctifying the day. That's literally uMekudash versus Tadir, because on an average week, how many Kiddushes do you say? Two. Oh, actually one. You say one Kiddush. You only do it Friday night, right? When you don't say Mekadesh HaShabbos, Shabbos day Kiddush. That's why the rabbis actually gave a whole bunch of other prayers is to make it feel better, right? You only say Kiddush. You only say Geffen. But let's pretend you're in Italy, right? Which blessing do you say more frequently? A blessing on wine, or the blessing on Shabbos?
If you're in Italy, it's probably constantly on wine.
Yep.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So yeah, Maxine can have first person proof, right? Wine or Shabbos?
Wine.
There we go. Right. Listen, who wants to go into business with me? I've been wanting to like create like a kosher boxed wine, or like a kosher like table wine, right? Like an affordable kosher wine. So like we too can just have like a mediocre bottle of wine with our pasta.
If you live in Israel, you can.
Gewalt. All right. So I think that's the best argument for Zionism I've heard.
Absolutely.
Right. So let's make Aliyah. So we say blessing on wine more frequently because it's food, right? Like, yeah, bottle of wine. You open up a wine on Shabbos, you got to finish it, right? Good. So you say the blessing on wine more frequently. So it's more frequent. And think about the order of Kiddush. Which bracha comes first?
The
one on wine. Even though it's the less special bracha. Because the one that's on Shabbos is more special. It's Shabbos. So that seems like a good proof, doesn't it? That in the conflict between frequency and specialness, which is victorious?
Frequency.
Frequency.
Right? Say,
Tashma is always on the side of frequency. Do we see that? Every example that the Tashma is giving, right? Every time that the Gemara cites a Tashma, it's always trying to prove that in a battle between constancy and specialness, constancy wins, because it sees it as a conflict between one thing characterized by one and the other one characterized by the other. And when they bump heads, frequency wins. And that's every Tashma. You just have to plug and chug. Okay? And then here comes a pushback to it. Atu. Now, can we predict what the Atu is going to be?
Doesn't Shabbos make the blessing on the wine special as well?
Exactly. When you say Borei Pri HaGefen, and I think this is actually proven by our experience. And Leon, maybe this is one aspect of the question you're asking. Maybe this is a good answer to it, right? When you say the words Borei Pri HaGefen on Shabbos, does that feel like every day, or does that feel like Shabbos?
Feels like Shabbat. Absolutely.
It's part of Kiddush, right? It's part of Kiddush. So the Atu has a point. Even though Borei Pri HaGefen is something we say, you can say on a Wednesday, right? When you say it on Friday night, Shabbos, right? You say it special, you say it in a way with intention, you don't just like rattle off a brucha, right? You say it in a way that gives honor and respect to Shabbos. I think the Atu has made a very good point. Borei Pri HaGefen versus Mekadesh Shabbos isn't a conflict between special and not special, because they're both special. They're both infected with the holiness of Shabbos, right? It's not that the Mekadesh of Shabbos is the only Shabbos bracha. Borei Priya Geffen is a Shabbos bracha too, when you say it on Shabbos. So the conflict between the two of them isn't a conflict between special and not special. It's a conflict between two things that are special and one of them's more frequent. And when you have two things that are special and one of them's more frequent, the answer is obvious. It's the more frequent one. The Mishnah told us that already. All right, so we see the way that Tashma and Atu, it's the same thing being done again and again, right? And I think Eric is right in saying that the rabbis were aware of classical rhetoric and they use rhetoric quite nicely. But here what we have are two logical principles, right? The logical principle is trying to say here's a conflict between two rules, and in a conflict between two rules, one of them succeeds, and the second one is saying no because one of the rules is actually resolved ahead of time. So it's not a meta conflict between two rules. The rule works on its own, one of the rules. All right, here's another one. And here we have our first cited rabbi. Now it's worth noting the Tashmas are all authentic Tanaitic sources, but this is the first time we're having a rabbi quoted. That's worth noting. It says Tashma, to Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Halacha. That's surprising. Okay, here's a halacha, he says. If a person prays mincha, and then afterwards should pray musaf. Now wait a second. That doesn't make sense. What do we pray first, musaf or mincha?
Musaf, mincha is later.
He says halacha. He says halacha. What's going on? Here's the question. Let's say you went to shul and you stayed for Shacharis, and you stayed for Torah, and then your baby starts crying, and you take the baby out of the shul, take the baby for a walk, da-da-da-da-da. And by the time you get back, it's mincha time. Which do you daven first?
Mincha.
Mincha. Why? Doesn't musaf come first?
You've missed the time for musaf. It's already time for mincha.
You don't.
No, you can say musaf at any point during the day.
Well,
but
after 7.5 hours, but yes.
Right. But I mean, I'm thinking about this in terms of like time bound versus, non-time bound. So when you're thinking of that for like davening for women, so musaf is technically like, so women are often considered not to be chayav for musaf, but they are considered to be chayav for shacharis and mincha. Of course, this is in
and
certain, sorry?
And Mariv.
Yes, okay. I mean, some people disagree, but...
Wrong.
Okay. Well, they're...
I'm just
Durabanan, but not Duraisa. Okay.
I'm just joking.
Okay. Yeah, so that would... In that case, I don't know, I feel like that's comparable to the Tadir being more taking precedence.
Okay, but let's simplify it. Let's say it is a man, and the man, as he should be, is taking the baby out for a walk. It's his job. They decided she's going to stay in shul. He's going to take the baby out. Fine. And he comes back, and it's like a winter day. It's a very long walk. He comes back at like 3:30 p.m., and it's mincha time. Okay? Which service do you do first? And the answer is you do mincha first.
Mincha.
Why? Because in a conflict between
frequency and kedusha. Frequency, I guess, would.
Good. But again, and the atu works the same exact way. It's Shabbos mincha, right? So again, the Tashma from Rabbi Yochanan is saying, when you have mincha before you and musaf before you, you need to do mincha first because mincha is more frequent, even though Shabbos musaf is special. And the atu comes back and says, no, it's Shabbos mincha, right? It's not a conflict between special and frequent. It's a conflict between two special things and one's more frequent. You always do mincha first. You do mincha first because tadir ve'eno tadir, tadir kodam, right? Something's frequent, something's less frequent, you do the frequent thing first. The Atu is working in the same exact way, right? The Atu is saying just because it's called Shabbos Musaf doesn't mean Mincha on Shabbos isn't special too. And because of that, we don't have a meta conflict between the rules. We have an easy conflict within one rule, right? Two things of equal importance, and one of them is more frequent. The frequent one goes first. Okay. So that's an example of something that we see that's actually potential in our lives, right? You take the baby out for a walk, you come back, and it's mincha. That's an actual rule. Another good example of that, by the way, is just the way in which frequency and not frequency works. If you, for some reason, taking care of a baby, were sick and bad, or whatever it is, you missed the zman for a prayer, right? You missed shacharit. When mincha time happens, you can do two amidas, one to make up for it. But which one do you do first? The mincha or the makeup? You do the mincha first, and you do the makeup second. Right? Because it's not that the mincha is more, it's that the constant version goes first. Right? The consistent goes first. And the makeup, the exception, goes second. That's just a little bit of halacha l'maisa, right? Practical halacha.
So you would do that with Musaf too, like, which wouldn't be unusual for me to get late to shul.
Wait. That's exactly what we're talking about. You missed Musaf, as it were.
No. The other way, you miss Shachrit. And you get there and they're starting Musaf. They just
Who would ever do that? Who would ever
never, right?
Get to shul in time for Musaf?
But you would do the Amida for Shachrit first.
No,
and
you
then
do Musaf first.
You would do the Musaf first?
You do, if you missed the time for Shachris, you do the Musaf first, and then you do another Musaf Amida after that to make up for it.
So you do them as two Musaf Amidas, you don't add the Shachrit Amida.
If you missed the Zman, yes.
Hivanti. Okay, great.
Here's the real halacha l'maisa question.
Then are you saying the same thing twice? I didn't think you're supposed to do that.
You do. But one of them you have to be clear in your brain. The reason you're doing it is to do an amida to take the place of the Shachris one. But you do the Musaf twice. Well, the Musaf is a weird question actually. That's a tough question. There's people on both sides. The real halacha l'maisa question is you get to shul in time for Kiddush, right? That who would ever do that? Right. Okay, so
You were back there to have Kiddush.
Gewalt. Yes, JFK, just for Kiddush. All right, so Tashma. If you have yesterday's shlamim, leftovers, and you have today's chatat or rasham, yesterday's shlamim takes precedence. Okay. Now this is interesting. So we have two sacrifices, right? We already talked about the ordering of the sacrifices. Which is more important? The shlamim, which is like a gift offering that you offer because something nice happened? Or the sacrifice that makes sure that you're good with God? Which one is more important?
Good with God.
The one that you're good with God, yes, because that one is like the most important sacrifice of all. Okay. Except, if you have leftovers from yesterday's shlamim, you should eat those first. What? How? Why? How is this trying to be used? Right, it's trying to be used the same exact way. Right, it's trying to say we have a conflict between special and not special, and the more frequent one works. Right, the more frequent one is shlamim because it can be offered whenever you want. Chatat is a much more rare occurrence, so shlamim should go first. But then we have another pushback on it. It says, but this one's phrased differently. It says, ha idi v'idi diyam chatas v'asham kadmi. Really though, is it that one is more frequent, or is it that both of them are equally possible, but one of them happens more? All right, so that's another way of thinking about it. Right, and again, kind of going back to this question about logic and rules. When we talk about frequency, how do we define that? Do we define it empirically, i.e. the thing that happens more in your life? Or do we define it in terms of more of an abstract rule-based way, right? One that will happen more, or one that should happen more. right? So because shlamim and chatas are equally possible, maybe neither of them, right? Maybe neither of them is more frequent than the other. For example, we see if both chatat and the shlamim were on the same day, then chatat should take precedence, even though shlamim is more common. Oh, wait a second. So maybe the reason shlamim takes precedence isn't because it's more constant, but is rather because why? What's distinguishing about it? It's from yesterday.
From the previous day.
It's from yesterday. It's going to get spoiled, right? It's a very simple reason. We don't need to overthink this, right? The reason is because it's from yesterday and they don't have a refrigerator. So it's like basic conservation, right? Like the thing from yesterday takes precedence because you don't want it to go bad. Okay, good. So here we have like kind of a little bit of like a from a left field kind of perspective, right? Like we weren't maybe expecting that. We wanted always to be these rule-based things, but sometimes real life like again from the beginning, like what Eric was saying in the beginning, or others, right? That like sometimes it's just you actually can't always avail yourself of rules. I found this a very interesting one. It's the most technical kind of hypothetical that's offered, but I didn't want to skip it because it's one of the ones that really resists the rules principle. Right? It resists how maybe this isn't really all about rules. Maybe it's really about the metzias, right? Really just maybe it's about the stuff. Maybe it's just about the situation as it presents itself to you. But back to the rules. We like the rules. Okay. So I want to skip this little meta reflection on the question of what Tadir means because we're heading to the end, but I want to get us to the last point. So here we have perhaps, a special kind of pushback. The special pushback is that maybe we missed is this. Usually the Tashma is trying to prove that Tadir wins. This time, though, it's going on at it the other way around. Right? Because it's saying, the conclusion it comes to in the end is that actually, Chatat and Asham, once you get rid of the fact that yesterday rules, right? Let's say they're both from today. So you have a Chatat, which is the most holy, and you have a Shlamim, which is just a normal sacrifice. And the Shlamim happens a lot more in your life, because God willing, you should have more opportunities to give gifts than you have to make atonement, right? So Shlamim is considered Tadir, and Chatat is Eino Tadir. So if you have a Shlamim from today and a Chatas from today, which one wins?
Chatat.
Chatat. And here we have an example of the only time Tashma is being used to prove the other side. Every other time we saw the meta conflict between Tadir and uMekudash, Tashma was trying to prove that in that conflict between the two rules, Tadir wins. And then the Atu came along and said, no, we don't really have a conflict between two rules. We have one rule, and it works. But here we have the Tashma taking the other side of trying to prove actually that uMekudash should take precedence. And here we have them, Rava and Rav Huna, pushing back and saying, wait a second, when we say constant, what do we mean? Like, we never actually asked the question, what do these categories really mean? Right? Rava says, are you speaking of commonality? We need consistency. The language he uses matsui or tadir. Tadir is the category that we've been talking about, which means consistency. Matsui means things that tend to happen more. I'll give you an example. In here we have, in a sense, like a funny way, right? Let's say what's more valuable? Things you do constantly on purpose, or things that always happen to you? Right? Accidents aren't the same thing as priorities. that make sense? Someone on the same team as you in your work is not the same thing as the person that you happen to pass every day on your walk to work, whom you don't notice. Does that make sense? Someone you share a commute with, whom you never meet, is just as constant as the person you share a team with at work. But only one of those are logged in your brain as consistent. Does that example make sense? All right? Something just happening is not the same thing as something being consistent. It's kind of like what makes a good friend. Somebody who is consistently there for you in your life. But let's say there's someone who is accidentally there in your life. That is not the same thing as being a friend, right? Right? Someone that another way of putting that is like you have a friend that you make sure to see every day versus someone that you happen to see every day. Equal numbers of times you see each other, but one of them means more. And maybe Tadir versus uMekudash isn't quantity versus quality. Maybe there's a quality in Tadir as well. Because it's not just strict quantity we're talking about. It's a relationship to the quantity. Right? You can see X person with your eyeballs on your commute to work. Yes, we remember commutes. On your commute to work, you see the exact same person, but you never log their existence in your brain because you don't know who they are. And that's very different than from someone that you see every day and you know that you're seeing them every day. Right? That's the difference between accidents and intention. So, Rava is saying, just because something happens more doesn't mean it's actually more consistent. It could just be an accident. And then Rav Huna says back to him, but aren't they the same? X equals X. Aren't commonality and consistency the same? Isn't there a Braita that says that there are two sacrifices that if you don't do them on purpose, you get kares, you get excommunicated. Very bad. But if you don't do them by accident, because the on purpose punishment's so bad, it's like double jeopardy, you don't get the other one. Except maybe not. Because the Pesach offering, right, the Paschal offering, you shouldn't have to bring the sacrifice because you missed it by accident, because it's not common. But something like very common, like Mila, right, Brit Mila, the circumcision, that one you do have to bring the sacrifice if you miss it. Now let's just zoom out for a second. Why would the Torah have an interest in, let's use this term, punishing people for missing something more consistent? Think about the ways in which punishments are supposed to work. Another way of asking.
Maybe it's a correction.
Good.
So that because you should be doing, let's say it's like getting up every morning and davening shachrit. You should be doing this every morning. So there's you don't do it for a bit, and then we're gonna get you to start doing it again.
Good.
It's a deterrent,
right? It's a deterrent. Right?
Doesn't the more severe punishment take precedence?
Right. So in this case, it's not that you didn't do it on purpose. You forgot. And that's different. Right? Forgetting something, it's like the difference between manslaughter and murder. Right? So in this case, you can understand a logic, right, in which you would say, to make sure that people don't neglect important things, I'm going to punish them if they do. That makes sense. Such that if someone, right, like, you're starting a new job, steep learning curve, and you forget to like file this form with this supervisor or whatever, it would be an unreasonable manager that would punish you for that, right? It would be an exceptionally punitive manager who would punish you for forgetting something that you had just learned. that you have not had experience with. It's a more reasonable manager that would dock your pay or punish you in some way for something that is a fundamental aspect of your job. Right? You're working at the McDonald's, lo Elenu, and you forget to empty the grease trap. And that's a fundamental aspect of your job. And then there's a grease fire. You're at fault. Right? You can't say, I mean, how could you blame me? It's part of your job. That's part of the essential aspect of your job working at McDonald's. You empty the grease trap, you dummy. But if you had just started at McDonald's, you could imagine someone letting you off the hook for forgetting to empty the grease trap, right? I mean, not in this terrible dystopia we live in, maybe, but point is, it's something we can easily imagine. Someone forgiving you for something that you had just learned. That is a good example of consistency versus non-consistency, right? It makes sense to punish somebody for something that is an essential aspect of their life. It is less reasonable to punish somebody for something that they don't have constant experience with. Okay? So, how many babies do you tend to have a year? Let's go back to the original question. Do you have more babies than you observe Passovers? How many Passovers have you observed in your life, Susie? Give me a round number. In the tens. 20, 30?
I declined to answer the question.
Somewhere. Right. Okay, fine. A reasonable number of Passovers Susie has observed. How many babies have you circumcised?
Me personally?
Yeah, no, I mean, have you been party to their?
How many brisses have I been to?
Yeah, let's say. Oh, that's much better. How many brisses have you been to?
Like 10.
Okay, but fewer than Passovers, right?
Fewer than Passovers.
Aha! And yet, Passover offering is seen as less frequent, less consistent. Explain that.
I don't have as many Orthodox friends as maybe people did back then. Having lots of babies.
I'll put it this way. Can you set your clock to Passover? Yeah, about once a year, right? Once every 12 months, sometimes once every 13. Passover? Good. Can you set your clock to baby futures? And that's the difference between commonality and consistency, right? I've observed Passover is something that happens to all of us all the time, every year. A Brit Milah is something that happens to anyone at any time during the year. So in a sense, what we're measuring now is potential rather than actual. A Brit Milah is seen as more constant because it could happen any day. You don't know. Passover, you know exactly how many times it happens. Such that, if you are especially rabbit-like and active, you could theoretically have 2 brisses in a year. Please don't. Please don't. But you could theoretically have 2 brisses in a year. You can never have 2 Passovers in a year. Never, ever. Okay? Secondly, if you are impure in some way during Nisan, and then impure again during ER when Pesach Sheni shows up, you could have 0 Passovers. But you could have a bris. All right? Sorry, you're not allowed to be part of the Passover offering if you are not ritually pure. And the reason Pesach Sheni exists a month later is to be like a catch-all for people who missed it the first time around. So it's theoretically possible, if you were just unlucky, that you could miss both opportunities for a Passover offering. When I say Passover offering, I mean the Torah obligation to offer the Paschal lamb. I don't mean like having a Seder. Okay? Point is that even though you've had more X number Passovers in your life, you always have a chance to have a bris. Always. Always, always. And then Rava pushes back, and I'm going to ignore the first part of his answer. He says, no. Mila is more common than the Paschal offering for exactly that reason. Right? Mila, you can have more of them. You can have more of them in your life. Okay. Now here's what's very funny. So what was the tashma that kicked off this whole thing? The tashma that kicked off this whole last part is it's a tashma, which means it's quoting a Mishnah, right? As in Breita before. Technically, actually, tashma is quoting a Mishnah. Titania is quoting a Breita. So these are actually all been Mishnaic quotes, many of them. Okay? And this one is interestingly from the Mishnah from our Sugya. You missed, or I didn't say. So the Mishnahs that our Sugya has been dealing with weren't actually immediately preceding our Sugya at all. This whole conversation that we have follows a different Mishnah. And here is the quote that it follows. Just as sacrifices take precedence in being offered, so they take precedence in being eaten. Okay, so just like there's an order, you meet there's the president, the vice president, and the prime minister, the premier, and the mayor. Whose hand do you shake first? Prime minister. Whose hand next?
Premier.
The premier. And whose hand last?
Mayor.
The mayor. Good. Order of importance, order of contact. Okay? So just like in the order of sacrifices, tamid and then the other ones, you eat them in that order as well. Okay? So yesterday's shlamim and today's shlamim, this should sound familiar. Yesterday's take precedence. Why? Because the order of them being offered is the order that they are eaten. Okay. Yesterday's shlamim and today's chatat, or asham. Which one gets eaten first? Well, now we have a new rule. And this is a totally different rule. Because this isn't about consistency, and this isn't about uMekudash. This is about, again, I want to say this is ultimately about like refrigeration. Right? This is really about conservation. The order of them offering is the order of them being eaten. First in, last out. No, first in, first out, sorry. First in, first out, okay? So yesterday's shlamim takes precedence over the chatat, even though the chatat's more important. Why? Because first in, first out. Okay. These are the words of Rebbe Meir. But the Chazal say what? The chatat takes precedence because it is more uMekudash. This is the Mishnah that spikes this whole Sugya. I want to make clear what the editors of the Sugya did. Because again, what kind of frames this whole class is actually showing that the Talmud is not just a work of law, and not just a work of logic, or even just a work of rhetoric. It's also a work of literature. And the editorial jujitsu of the Sugya is brilliant. Because what it did was it factored in all those two earlier Mishnayot, which are in the beginning of the chapter, as our launching pad, as a way of showing that it's our Mishnah, the one that immediately precedes the Sugya, that is the key to it all. It's this Mishnah that's being used. But it only releases that as a time bomb at the end.
So I'm trying to put together, because I'm just thinking of my own studies. The first Sugya after the Mishnah seems to be very, very different from the last Sugya before the next Mishnah in what they're trying to say. And is that basically established that what is the first Sugya after the Mishnah has this kind of importance, and what is the last Sugya before the Mishnah has a different kind of importance? Because I noticed they're very different.
Right, so this Mishnah that I tricked you by putting at the end is actually the Mishnah that's at the beginning. But what it's...
No,
how it's being...
about the two differences between the Sugya, which is exactly after the after the Mishnah, the first Sugya after the Mishnah, and the way in which the last Sugya before the next Mishnah has a different flavor to it, as far as I remember from my studying.
So this is all one Sugya, excepting the Mishnahs. Right? Sugya is one rabbinic discussion. So I want to show in this how the rabbis are taking all of these materials, but not in actually a way that leads us from point A to point Z, but is rather actually taking us from A to Z back to A again. Because the coup de grace of the discussion ends up being the first thing that we would have seen. Right? The source that ends up being the most substantive proof. Right? Because I mean, I want to go back to the structure here, right? What was the structure? Tashma atu, tashma atu, tashma atu, tashma atu. Right? Citing a Tannaitic source, pushing it away. Citing a Tannaitic source, it doesn't work for this reason. Citing a Tannaitic source, it doesn't work for this reason. And finally, we get to a source that works. But how does it work? And I want us to remember, what's the example it gives? Yesterday's shlamim versus today's chatat. And yesterday's shlamim wins. But it's completely now rejiggered. Because now it's being proven to be something about Tadir. Not something that's about refrigeration anymore. Right? We have a rule in this Mishnah. First in, first out. Last in, last out. That's the rule. But that rule's gone here. That the rabbis have creatively appropriated, right, earlier material and represented it in a new context for a completely different purpose. This is the literary genius of the Talmud, is that it takes, it's like a scrapbook, right? It's like a rabbinic scrapbook, but in a way that makes a comic. Because it's not just pictures next to each other. It's snippets that are having a conversation. It's like Lawrence Ferlinghetti's radical poetry, right? Snipping up books to make new poems. The Talmud takes raw material and ordinates it, right? Puts it in order. And so, sorry, I'll go back to the comics example. Comics are called, in like technical language, sequential art. It's art in sequence. And the sequence is what makes the meaning. Because when you see one picture of someone reaching open with a door, right? And the second picture in which a door slams, bam! What do you assume happened in the middle? The guy slammed the door, but you didn't see it. That's what's called closure, right? In technical comic book language, that's what's called closure. That's what the Talmud does. The Talmud takes things and puts them in order so that they talk to each other. So it took this Mishnah, even though it's dealing with a totally different topic, and then ends up putting it in a new context in a way that gives it a whole new meaning. It's an incredible bit of like DJ remixing, right, of rabbinic literature. And it's not done in a way that's dishonest. It's done in a way that's creative, but in a way that juices the material for as much as you can get from it. I mean, what we're left with, right, in the end of this conversation is that only Rebbe Meir's position is given here, right? Rebbe Meir says, yesterday's shlamim versus today's chatas, shlamim takes precedence because earlier thing gets eaten earlier. But Chazal, right? There's the majority rabbinic opinion say, no. The Chatat takes precedence. Why? Take a guess why. And you have to remember all the way back to the beginning of the Mishnah.
It's more Mekudash. Mekudash.
More uMekudash.
Yeah, it's much more sacred, holy.
And this launches us into the debate. Because the Chazal are on the Atu side. And then Rebbe Meir gets positioned as being on the Tashma side. Do we see how it is only through discussion and analysis that these things gain meaning? Right? Through this source now being represented in this Sugya here, the Sugya is actually playing out the debate that the rabbis see as incipient in that Mishnah. Right? Mishnah 1 said Tadir. Mishnah 2 said uMekudash. But we haven't actually seen a conflict between the two because Mishnah 1 versus Mishnah 2, they're not talking to each other. They're just next to each other. Oh, but things next to each other need to talk to each other, says the Talmud. And when we see Mishnah 6 here, we have exactly that debate, says the Talmud. It's not obvious from here, because it seems like Rebbe Meir is just saying, make sure that things don't get spoiled. Eat the older things first. You know, jerky, whatever. That's what Rebbe Meir is saying. And the Chazal are coming through and saying, no, Mishnah 2. Right? uMekudash takes precedence always. So then the Talmud has to come and represent Rebbe Meir in a way that supports Tadir. Right? It supports this debate that it's trying to have. It takes Rebbe Meir totally out of context and represents him, right? Rejiggers his opinion to now serve a completely different purpose, but it's one that they see as really being what the Mishnah is really getting at. Namely, and this is back to Leon's intervention, what's really important. What's really important? And how do we make the hard choices when we have a choice in front of us? That's what we're getting at here. It's an incredibly subtle bit of like radical editing that the Talmud does. It takes its creative scissors and it snips away until what it does is it takes this raw material and fashions like a sculptural dialogue out of it. Right? It takes these things that are like blocks. Mishnah 1 is a block. It gives you a rule that works. Mishnah 2 is a block. It gives you a rule that works. And it takes the blocks and it builds a structure out of them.
What am I missing here? Is it like you're celebrating the like this, it's a kind of creativity in the context of, like they couldn't, to use maybe a bad metaphor, like they couldn't color outside the lines of the Mishnah? Like the Mishnah was the only defined the parameters of what they could express. And so they figured out a way of expressing or elaborating ideas, but without, I don't know, without diverging too far outside what the Mishnah had already given them.
Right. So you're saying, wouldn't actually perhaps a more clear example of creativity be like God, right? Yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. Right? Why do I have to be dealing with the raw material that I've received?
Sure. I don't even want, like, yes, but also like without it being an abstract question, like just what was their pressure? You know what I mean? Like, what was the impetus to do this? Like, what did that Mishnah text mean to them? And why did they use it the way they did? Like, I appreciate that you're saying there's a literary quality to it, but I'm guessing that wasn't the first thing on their mind. Like, I'm guessing they weren't Lawrence Ferlinghetti, right? Like, they weren't like trying to see what they could create through this kind of, through an interesting sort of destruction and fusion.
Right. So I would say a couple of things. I think it's a very sharp question. So I think what we're dealing with here is what it means to be creative with tradition. and what it means to be creative with tradition, and traditio, right, means to pass something on, a masora, right? What it means to be creative with tradition is not to say tradition is non-creative, right? Because I'm receiving something that I have to deal with, but rather just the question of creativity is, what do I do with it? Right, so there's a way of taking what you're receiving and then doing something new with it. I think that's a good example. And I think not only that, but like, in a way, as human beings, there's no way outside of that. We're always in some way receiving, and we're always in some way refashioning. Right? We're not ever, like, we're always in some way embedded in a tradition. Right? The greatest poets and the greatest dancers and the greatest artists all learn from the masters. Right? All learn from the canon. All learn from people that inspire them. All learn from their teachers. And then they further it. They push it in a new direction. They do something new with what they've received. I think that is human creativity. And I think the Talmud is a really striking but subtle example of that. Secondly,
Yeah. Okay.
I think another thing that they're doing in terms of, let's say, inside the content, is I think what they're seeing is incipient in this Mishnah, the conflict that they're trying to expose. Namely, this conflict between consistency and exceptionality, right? Consistency and specialness. But they're only able to do that by creating this dialectic, right? Creating this, well, here's one way of responding, and then no. Here's one way of responding, but actually not, right? Yes, no, or yes, anti-yes, yes, anti-yes. And I think what they're doing is, again, like a kind of again, taking what they're receiving, the raw material of Mishnah 6, and saying, oh, there's something more going on here than just the rule question. It's not just about which sacrifice gets eaten first. It's really about what's important, right? It's not just about what meat gets skewered and what meat gets consumed, right? An abstruse particular question of ritual temple law. It's really about when you're presented with two things that both make claims on you in two different ways, how do you hash out which one takes precedence? And that's a really important conversation. And they're going to take these particular examples as case studies in trying to figure out the larger human question of how do we figure out what's important and how do we figure out what takes precedence. When the rubber hits the road, what are you going to do?
It's like law.
Yeah.
It's very much like, I mean, I had to read, I'm not a lawyer, but I had to go through a lot of stuff when I was defending myself during my divorce. And it's a similar kind of thing. You look at precedent and the way they discuss like case studies and keep going on. And I think what they're doing here is also, they're setting like halachic precedents and discussing like what's said in the Mishnah, and they're trying to develop a halachic response by weighing this against that.
Right, but I think something that's special about halakha, let's say versus secular state law, is that halakha is a meaning-making system, not just a rules-making system. And I think maybe you see some certain ways of doing that with certain political factions about the Constitution and things like that it is like a kind of a whole meaning system. But I think like thinking about Torah is really what it's trying to do is organize our lives, but not just in terms of our bodies. It's trying to organize the meaning in our lives. It's trying to organize what our lives can mean. It's not just saying, what meat do you shovel into your mouth first? It's really saying, when you decide to eat the shlamim before the chatas, or vice versa, what does that really mean? What informs that choice? Right? What significance can be found in what the Torah is asking of you? And what kind of life, then, is the Torah asking you to make with what kinds of priorities in it? I want to leave us with this maybe kind of simmery, kind of final thought. That one of the things I mentioned in how I've described the class in the promotional material is that this is really asking a big question in terms of what it means to have a religious life. because I think it's asking us something that's very challenging, but maybe is more intuitive to somebody who is in like a discourse of halakha. That I think it's very easy to get caught up in specialness, right? Like peak experiences, special occasions, Shabbat, right? Going to shul on Shabbat or something like that. And that is a regular practice for many of us. I think there's something that's kind of the way I think what we're getting at in the question of commonality or accidents versus consistency, intention, right? Things that like are something that you relate to intentionally, is that consistency is also a meaningful category. It's also a category with value and quality to it. And to commit yourself to do something regularly is also a statement of value, because it's saying that your time is valuable and you're using your time in a way that shows that you consider this thing important and worth your time. I want to thank you all for your consistency and your showing up and your being willingness to show up on Zoom and these funny circumstances. But it means so much to me and so much to a number of us people I've talked to be able to use our time and to create this space together and to create a community of learners that is not just about the consumer experience of trying to market a class, but I think something that I've really valued and that I feel so honored by and feel so lucky about is that what we've done over the past 9 months, I think for many of us, is to create a community of learners together. And that consistency of what it means to learn how each other think and what kinds of insights that we can each bring to this, right? How we can each co-construct the learning together makes this experience all the richer. So Tadir and uMekudash are not always conflicting, because Tadir and uMekudash often come together. What is consistent is what is holy. And what is holy is honored by being consistent. Speaking of constantly, we're doing a ton of stuff this week. Tomorrow night we're doing a Tu B'Shvat Tish with Shari Shemayim and the Toronto Beit Midrash at a certain time. Information's on the flyer. And then Thursday night we're doing a Zoom B'Shvat Seder. Information's gone out what foods you need, but please feel free to reach out directly if you need some more guidance. And that'll be really fun. That'll be at 7 o'clock, this Zoom link. And then Saturday night, probably 6:15, we'll be doing Havdalah together. And then we're taking a couple weeks as a break. But in mid-February, we'll be rebooting the Kabbalah class, and we'll be doing, again, have a little bit more time. We'll have a little bit more opportunity to, like this in a way, like get more in depth with the literature and develop more of a relationship to each of the texts and each of the figures that we'll be talking about. I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited to continue on this journey with all of you. And I have also was really excited about the suggestion for a Midrash class. I have so many classes I want to do. Midrash, Agada, right? Rabbinic legends from the Talmud, really fun, weird stuff. Halacha, to show actually how halacha is also not so dry. Halacha is also very meaningful and very philosophical. There's so much Torah to learn, please God. And please God, we'll be able to do it in many different ways, online and in person. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful night. Have a great rest of your week, and happy early Tu B'Shvat.
Thank you. Josh, will you be doing the Parshat HaShavua classes?
Yeah, the Parsha class will continue.
On the Thursdays. I mean, not this Thursday, but other than that, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, and also Saturday is Shabbat Shira, because it's Shabbat B'Shalach when we read Shirat Hayam, a song. And a special Dvar Torah about Shabbat Shira coming out this week too. It's a very special Shabbat, but try to make a little bit of time to time to sing. Time to sing some Zemira. Always good.
Sounds good.
All right, folks. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.